Hello, and welcome back for the third in this series of podcasts on the parables of Jesus. Uh, Today, I'd like to prompt us to think about uh, how these parables do or should serve as metaphors or models for how we live our lives today as Christians. They're not just stories Jesus told some 2,000 years ago. I'd like to share a story I ran across in my current book project about how Native Americans helped freedom seekers fleeing slavery, something that took place in the 19th century. It immediately made me think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it reminded me that we face the same choices and the same concerns in modern times. In this story, however, the victim by the side of the road is a runaway slave. And the Good Samaritan are Native Americans. Otherwise, the story is very similar. It's the story of a man named William Swan. William Swan was born into slavery in Virginia about 1824. And we don't know a lot about him, except at some point, at least by the late 1850s, he ran away. And he made it ultimately to Park County, Indiana, west central Indiana, where he met a young lady, 17-year-old young lady, named Louisa Morgan. Her parents had been slaves. They had been manumitted in 1840, that is, privately freed. They had left for the North, covered wagon. This was the 19th century. And they and William Swan had the same fears because just like there were robbers on the Jericho-Jerusalem road, there were in the lower Northwest, the lower Midwest today we'd call it, slave catchers who were trying to catch runaway slaves like William Swan and return them, and kidnappers who were trying to catch people like Louisa Morgan and her family, who were legally free, who had documents, but those documents could easily be destroyed by someone capturing them and faking up slave sale documents, taking them south and selling them into slavery. Well, William and Louisa met, married in 1860, and after worrying long enough about kidnapping and slave catching, they ultimately decided to make a move. And this may have been compounded by the fact that a year later, their first child, Delilah, was born, named after Delilah in the Bible. All these fears begin to weigh on them. And according to Morgan family lore, William and Louisa struck out for northern Michigan in 1861, late or early 1862. The best evidence I could find would suggest it was probably in the spring of 1862, after the ice had broke up in the Great Lakes, but early enough they could plant crops for the growing season. Headed northward from Chicago in a lake steamer to Traverse City, then walked the nearly 60 miles to what would become their new home on the north shore of Lake Charlevoix, as it's called today, which is east of the city of Charlevoix. Didn't have a lot of personal possessions. They would have had to walk the 60 miles from Traverse City to Charlevoix to their new home. And they were unique. They were the first African Americans to settle in the vicinity. The 1860 U.S. Census lists no colored residents in that part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, far northwest. If you use your hand, it's up here somewhere. And The 1870 census, after they'd been there a few years, only lists 9, 8 of which by that point were in their household. William, Louisa, and by then 6 children. Upon reaching their new home, they squatted on 40 heavily wooded acres just up a rise from the North Shore at the center of Pine Lake and began to carve a farm out of the wilderness. Local Native Americans soon introduced themselves to the new arrivals and offered their assistance. Without work animals, using only their own muscle, they cleared 16 acres of land, planted crops, built a 16 by 20 foot log cabin with a sleeping loft, and used what appeared to be some Native American farming techniques along the way, intercropping, planting squash in between the rows of corn. Well, as I've argued elsewhere, life on the Swan farm could be harsh, unfamiliar, and a lonely existence. You know northern Michigan. Winters were brutally long and cold. The surroundings differed substantially from their life on the Indiana prairie and in the South. Their Indian neighbors were friendly, but culturally very different. They were unacquainted with the varieties of trees, soil, and even some of the wild animals. Their nearest neighbor lived more than a half-mile away. Most days, even weeks passed without seeing anyone beyond the family. They were engaged in subsistence farming, growing or making nearly everything they needed to sustain themselves. A few times a year, they made their way to the nearest general store in Charlevoix, some 10 miles distance, and the all-day trip required them to walk the footpath along the lake, then return with supplies in a harness on their back. Life in northern Michigan in the 19th century could be an unrelenting struggle. Well, I think several factors allowed the Swans to negotiate this pioneer life. One was the relative safety they felt so far from the slave South. Another was the love and intimacy they shared. Later on, the Charlevoix Sentinel would comment on the kindness and respect that the two partners showed each other. A third was their growing family circle of children, which often filled the log cabin with joy and excitement. Once the farm had been established, 5 more children came in rapid succession. A girl named Luverta, a boy named Sedovia or Dovey, another girl, Louisa, a 4th girl, Meta, and another boy named George William after Louisa's father. The final factor that allowed them to make a go of it in the northern Michigan wilderness, however, was the neighborliness shown by their Native American neighbors. For the first few years, the Swans' only neighbors consisted of a community of some 300 Odawa, or Ottawa, and Ojibwe, or Chippewa, people centered around a church nearly 7 miles away from the Swan farm on the lake footpath and the Indian trails nearby. It was known as the Pine Hill Mission. Today, it's still active. You can still visit the church and be part of a service. It's known as the Green Sky Hill Indian United Methodist Church today. The congregation had been founded in the 1830s by an Ojibwe evangelist. They'd ultimately worshipped elsewhere, but they moved to the North Shore of Pine Lake, today's Lake Charlevoix, when white missionaries thought them, quote, too noisy when they prayed. They didn't like their contemporary worship, apparently. At first, they held services in a small dwelling, and later on, they built a building that still exists today. It's in a clearing in the forest, surrounded by a churchyard dotted with white wooden crosses marking the burial sites of members who died. Although the Swans never became members, they maintained a close relationship with the Green Sky Indians, as they were locally known. Under the protective gaze of the Green Sky Indians, the Swans seem to have thrived in the northern Michigan environment where they cast their lot. They felt relatively secure there, and they felt like they had allies because Peter Greensky, the pastor, and his family and the congregation seemed to feel an obligation to help free the suffering slaves in the South. When the Civil War took place and non-white soldiers were allowed to enlist in the middle of the war, Peter actually, as pastor, encouraged this from the pulpit. Two of his sons enlisted in Company K of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, an all-Indian unit. Benjamin Greensky, however, one son was killed at the Battle of Spotsylvania in Virginia in 1864, and a second son, Jacob Greensky, suffered a disabling wound 1 year later at the Siege of Petersburg in Virginia. For the Swans, however, their farm and surroundings seemed like a place of safety. Circumstances would change, however, after the war was open. During the war, the Lincoln administration passed something you might know, the Homestead Act, which allowed individuals or families to move on to homesteaded land, claim some acreage, improve it, live on it for 5 years, and then it would be theirs. In November 1867, William Swan filed a homestead entry on the 40 acres that he had settled on and squatted on. Now, a variety of reasons, one of which is this law had become available, but another reason is the Homestead Act started to attract a lot of new white settlers into the area. And it wasn't just the Native Americans and this one black family. In June 1870, 2 white Union veterans killed William in what can only be described as a hate crime. It took place as he walked the 60 miles between his farm and Traverse City, where he planned to meet relatives arriving on a Lake Michigan steamer. As he passed through the village of Atwood, he was verbally accosted with racial epithets, the N-word, by 2 brothers, Gilbert and Charles Randall, who'd recently settled in the area and were offended by the presence of a black man. Guns were drawn, then eventually put away, but this was not the end of the affair. The Randalls and the 3rd white man followed Swan nearly 5 miles down the trail. Upon catching up with him just north of the village of Eastport, they shot him dead. Although both Randall brothers were arrested and jailed for the crime, they were eventually acquitted. When word of the murder reached the Greensky Indians, a group of them took their canoes across Lake Charlevoix, then walked down to Eastport to retrieve Swan's body, carrying it back home on an improvised stretcher. And it must have seemed strange to people in the white settlements they passed through, this group of Indian men bearing the body of a dead black man on their shoulders on a stretcher. When other local churches refused to bury a black man in their churchyard, the Greensky Indians interred him at the Pine Hill Mission amidst dozens of Native American graves. Sometime later, they placed a marble marker commemorating Swan's presence there. It noted that he was a Greensky brother. And I take this as, in death, the Greensky Indians had adopted him fully as one of their own. Well, some other tragedies hit Louisa Swan and her family that summer. Her youngest daughter, Meta, became deathly ill. Their cabin burned to the ground. They were in real trouble. The Greensky Indians stepped in and helped the family rebuild the cabin, and almost daily brought them enough fish and meal and vegetables to sustain them until the harvest. They were true good Samaritans. Well, Louisa's relatives outside the area kept writing her after they got word of William's murder. And they queried her about the dangers of living among the Odawa and Ojibwe in the wilderness of northern Michigan. They urged her to return southward where it was safe and she would be away from those savages. Louisa responded we have 3 letters from her that have turned up in the family Bible years later. They were discovered. She responded that, quote, "Better neighbors I have not lived with than these. They are indeed kind, and those Indians are so far from savages that they are the greater part of them Christians. They are not savages, but friends." Louisa and the Swan family had their own good Samaritans among the Green Sky Indians. And just as Jesus did in telling the parable, they weren't quite the people we would have suspected or penciled into the story. What does that tell us? Where should we be in the story? I think we should reflect on that, and also we should go out and seek to do those kinds of things when circumstances present us with an opportunity to live out, to act out Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. Thank you so much, and I hope these have motivated you to maybe go look at the parables, including the parable of the Good Samaritan. We know them, but we can always find new gems that inform and motivate our faith. Take care, and hope to see you all in the fall.